Hello, this is Pacific.ca from the Pacific Coast of Canada. Today, we present the second reading in the BC Legislative Assembly of Bill 20, the Local Elections Campaign Finance Amendment Act. It's a long name, but if you listen to the arguments in favor and against this issue, you may think of other alternative ways of financing political elections. Now Polling.ca enables you to participate in this political debate. Just select provincial governments right here, and then go to citizens legislation, and then almost at the bottom here you find financing electoral campaigns, and there is the poll. If your choice is not listed here, the only reason is that you have not posted your initiative on this poll yet. Here are some excerpts of the BC Legislative Assembly debate that happened on April 7, 2014.
Minister of Community, Sport and Cultural Development.
Honourable Speaker, I move that Bill number 20, entitled the Local Elections Campaign Financing Act, be read for the second time now.
Proceed.
Honourable Speaker, I'm pleased to move that the Local Elections Campaign Financing Act be read for the second time now. The legislation modernizes campaign finance rules for local government elections. Honourable Speaker, the great work of people who diligently work in local governments throughout British Columbia know that the rules governing local elections need to be renewed. And our government agrees. The system needs modernization. And that is why we worked together with the local governments through the joint BC Union of British Columbia Municipalities Local Government Elections Task Force to come up with these recommendations needed to make changes people want and people need. Specifically, the proposed legislation will require all election advertising to identify sponsorship information. It will authorize Elections British Columbia to play a new key role in local government elections, enforcing compliance with campaign finance rules. It will require third-party advertisers to register with Elections BC before sponsoring third-party advertising. This legislation will also require campaign finance disclosure statements be filed with Elections BC within 90 days following the election instead of 120 days. This legislation will authorize Elections BC to post online all candidate electoral organizations and third-party advertiser disclosure statements. Honourable Speaker, I ask that all members lend their support to this piece of legislation.
Thank the Minister and recognize the member from Coquitlam, Millardville.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. So, given that it was announced back in October 2nd, 2009, the Premier at the time, Gordon Campbell, announced the creation of a joint task force to make recommendations to update this legislation. And the work seemed to progress nicely. At first, a backgrounder was produced in January 2010, and the final report was delivered on May 28, 2010, just a couple of days before the deadline. The task group, Honourable Speaker, noted that in their report that, and I'll quote here from the letter from the Minister of the Day and the President Harry Nice from the UBCM, that the vast majority of local elections are effectively administered. These recommendations focus on the areas where the task force found gaps, namely campaign finance rules. And one key recommendation was for the task force to consider expense limits. And the rationale provided by the task force was that this would increase accessibility. The task force believes, and I'll quote, that expense limits would increase accessibility and fairness by leveling the playing field among candidates, encouraging candidate participation, and reduce the need for large contributions to fund expensive campaigns. Expense limits are expected to be more effective than contribution limits in promoting accessibility. Unlike contribution limits, expense limits reduce the need for large contributions, yet they do not limit the democratic discourse and the variety of voices that can be heard in an election. So, with all of this, there was certainly some clarity that expense limits needed to be part of any election reform that was going to come forward. And the focus at the time, if I would like to remind the Speaker, was getting ready for the 2011 local elections, which was 3 years ago. So here we are, 6 months before another local election, and this government is only tabling this legislation now. 3 years have passed, and in those intervening years, the most pressing recommendation, the one asking for expense limits isn't here. So it's not what's in here that I have a problem with. What's in here is actually pretty good. It's what's not in here, Honourable Speaker, that's a problem. So while this bill increases accountability, it enhances transparency, it strengthens compliance and enforcement, and that it even expands education and information, although I'm a little bit worried about how it will do that in the next 6 months, it utterly fails on increasing accessibility for the most accessible level of government for many communities. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.
Thank the member. Recognize the member from Caribou-Chicoutimi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is indeed an honour for me to stand here today and support this bill. I had the privilege with yourself, Mr. Speaker, and others to be on the task force, to work with local governments and put together this legislation, not in this form, but to put together the information that has been brought forward to the Minister to move forward with changes to an act that is 20 years old. I find it very interesting listening to the comments from my colleague across the floor. Normally, what I hear from across the floor, you didn't do enough consultation. Now I hear you took too long. So I'm a little bit confused, but I guess we'll move forward. There was much consultation put into this. We worked very closely with local governments, and I come from local government. I had many, many years of experience in local government and elections at the local government level. And to me, it's not about money. How much did you spend? It's about being a candidate. It's about your connection to your community, your connection to the people that elect you. The last election I ran in locally, spent a little more at the provincial level, but I spent $800. And I think that was the year that I spent the most, and that was my 6th election. It's about you going out and connecting with your community, and it's not always about money. And I feel in a system that if people choose to spend money, that is their prerogative, as long as it's registered, recorded, and we know who is supporting these candidates. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank the member. Recognize the member from Nanaimo.
This is Canada. And in most Canadian jurisdictions now, we accept and understand that the power of money in campaigns is just that. It is power. And it needs to be circumscribed. It needs to have limits placed on it. It needs to be dealt with in a way that protects democracy. You know, Honourable Speaker, you don't have to be very old in this province to remember when we had a corporate vote, for heaven's sakes, where corporations got to vote municipal elections. Now, I realize that may seem a very difficult concept for many members here who are elected by living, breathing voters, but in fact, that was the case. No, Honourable Speaker, that was a great step forward, eliminating the corporate vote. That was regarded as progress. And in most jurisdictions, Honourable Speaker, putting campaign spending limits on what candidates can spend or electoral organizations can spend is seen as a good thing. And so if this is remedial legislation, and I would suggest that is exactly what it is, then why not include the obvious remedy? The remedy that's included in other jurisdictions. The remedy which exists in our national elections, Honourable Speaker. I mean, if it's good enough for Confederation, so to speak, if it's good enough for the Dominion of Canada, why isn't it good enough for Puskapay or Hope or Nanaimo, Pitt River? Why isn't it good enough for them, Honourable Speaker, to have resort to the same kind of legislation that exists, where we have recognized that we don't want money to have an undue influence on our democratic processes?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I do stand in support of this legislation. And one of the things that is very clear to me that UBCM clearly said to the minister and to this government that they wanted a phased approach to this legislation. They did not want to see campaign financing done in a hurry. There are many issues around it that were raised around that table. And I sat there as a member of the UBCM executive and was very clear that there was not consensus around the table or even in the province with all of the stakeholders on where this particular issue should go. Of the 31 recommendations that were made, all of them are being moved on. The financing was the only one that UBCM clearly said to government, please do not move on this too quickly. We would like you to take a longer look. We need more consultation. And it is absolutely critical, Mr. Speaker, as we move into campaign financing at local government level. It is different than provincial. It is different than federal. And it needs to be sensitive to the diversity in this province. And I would ask the members opposite to take some sober reflection on what they're saying about what's wrong with this legislation, because they are criticizing local governments who have said to us that it meets their needs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I've been listening with open ears to see the Liberals justify allowing one person to make $1 million donation to Vancouver Council parties in support of the chosen political party he wants as just being allowing people to have their voice heard. Oh, it's just about letting people have their voice heard. One person wants to donate $1 million. Well, nobody will listen more to that man than the man who donates $1, because this is just about letting people have their voices heard. Well, Honourable Speaker, just as we have one vote, I don't think how anybody could justify saying unlimited local donations in this upcoming election, be they corporate, union, personal, should have no problem. I just don't understand that. That's not, to me, democracy. I think that's why in provincial elections, in federal elections, we have campaign spending limits, we have campaign donation limits, and in the federal election process, we actually have banned corporate and union donations. My council has been unanimous in making this request again and again and again and again and again, and the Liberals, I guess, refuse again and again and again and again. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.